Well, Eric, thank you so much for joining me, and thank you for being so patient with me with all of my tech issues. I was looking through everything that you're doing with the Utopia project. I took your quiz,
Wait, don't
and
tell me what your animal is. Oh,
I
sorry.
won't, I won't, I won't. Okay.
Okay, sorry.
No, no. I was gonna say I'm gonna share that later. Um, but well, why didn't you want me to tell you,
I was just
actually?
gonna guess. I love guessing. I don't know. That's
I
part
love
of
that.
part of the book is like trying to teach people, right? Like how to like figure things out and read people, through the methodology. And so I love to try to demonstrate it. Of course, I could always mess up. So there's that.
Of course. Yeah, that's exciting. So at the end, maybe?
Perfect.
Okay. Or is it something that you can typically figure out pretty quickly?
I mean, it just depends on how much someone exudes their personality. Generally when people or when it's easier to read someone, then I always say it's a better thing because it just shows confidence. Like when people have confidence in their personality, it comes out,
Mm,
right? Whether someone people are trying to hide it in some way, it's a little bit harder. But
for sure. Little elusives.
yeah,
Um,
you definitely
yeah,
have
let's
you definitely have like a shaman energy for sure. That's my guess. Would be some kind of shaman, probably like a baboon or humpback whale or something like that. That's the energy I'm getting so far, but I could be wrong.
interesting. Okay,
Yeah.
we'll see if it fluctuates throughout. Tell me about your background. The Utopia project looks so interesting and I'm intrigued. So, where did this come about?
Well, I started an education company I owned it for about a decade, and that was, in the mid aughts. But really it came before then. Like in school, I was like, I won't say I was one of those weird kids because I definitely could fit in like visually, but inside, I always felt a little different. Like a lot of kids were really into like, not to say it's wrong, but they're really into getting good grades and following the rules. And I just did not have that instinct. And I was like, is there something wrong with me? Like, am I a sociopath? And I started reading up on different personality types, and I started going through all that, like that rabbit hole or down that rabbit hole. And when I started my own company, I started using that practical experience to kind of create my own methodology. And that's when I started the Utopia Project.
Oh, so you started kind of figuring out how to diagnose yourself and not diagnose, but understand yourself on a deeper level.
Yeah, I think when I was in high school, I mean, I'm sure everyone feels that way, where everyone feels like, this need to try to find themselves. Or I shouldn't say this need, but they feel a little weird and feel a little awkward during adolescence. And so, I did a lot of my own,
Okay.
I say research, it just sounds good. I just read a bunch of books that I really wanted to do, right? Or I really wanted to
Oh,
read. And so from then, I started kind of seeing flaws in some, like, I'm not a big fan of extroversion and introversion. Like, I think it's a little flawed there. And from that, I started developing my own.
I love that. So then you started this education company. What was that? Like, how did that work?
We were contracted out by different school districts, and so we had about 1,000 students a year. Obviously, I did not see all of these students, but I had a squad of teachers that would go into people's homes, and so it's really cool because you get a one-on-one experience with your student, but also you'd be able to see their home life, their parents, and kind of see that dynamic. And I started realizing I need to like develop this methodology so my teachers could use it and I could teach it to them because every student should be treated differently. We're going to interact with them on a one-on-one level, and not every student is motivated in that same way, and not every teacher is motivated in that same way. And understanding the difference and how that might cause conflict was super important to like at least helping my teachers do a better job.
I love that because it wasn't just about the education. And I think maybe when we were growing up, everything was about being standardized. And so if we deviated at all from the norm, then we were weird versus being unique or eccentric. And so those types of things I think is a really beautiful thing that you advocated for these kids in order to make sure that they felt seen and heard and understood.
Yeah, I mean, even when we were talking before about like waking up early, right? As a kid, you're just told, "Oh, you got to wake up at," and kids still wake up at pretty god awful hours. I don't know. I mean, it's a little bit better now, and I always tell some of my students like, "Hey, I'm glad that you wake up early because I had to go through it." But in a logical sense, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, right? Like, I mean, we're not farmers anymore, or a lot of us aren't farmers anymore.
Yeah, I mean, my kids, they had late start schools and it was great because then they started at 9. And it made sense. We weren't waking them up in order to go to school and have to do that. And now they kind of just wake up naturally. And then we have an hour to get ready and then they go, but they seem kind of naturally primed to go and to learn versus I mean, when we were going to school, we woke up at like 6 a.m., started school at 7. It was just atrocious.
Yeah,
for
and it
us.
doesn't make sense, right? Because adults, not all adults are like that. I remember I have like notes on my report cards where the teacher would like write down, "Oh, please remind Eric that school starts at 7:30." And I'm like in second grade, so I asked my mom about that, and she's like, "Pff, that's your dad." And clearly, my dad wasn't getting me to school on time, but obviously, it wasn't my fault as a 7-year-old. And that was like the teacher's kind reminder to my dad, or maybe to my mom, to you know wake him up. But I think adults, we aren't like that. It's kind of like using profanity. I always think it's sometimes kind of odd that we tell kids, "Oh, you can't use this word, but when you turn 18, you can use this word," as if there's like this huge difference, right? Like, doesn't matter.
Yeah, and I it's funny too because I take my kids to school every Friday, and which is why I was running behind this morning, and they're late every Friday. I was just like, "Oh, no." It's always with me. I have this time blindness, and I'm sure things will take less time than they do, and then before we know it, I'm, like, scrambling, running, feeding my kids eggs with my hands right outside the car door, just, like, making sure they're fed before they go in. It's just all chaos.
Are you one of those people who's like, you can do everything in 15 minutes? It's like, "Yeah, I'll get there in 15 minutes, or I'll be done in 15 minutes."
Yeah, and then 2.5 hours goes by, and we're just like,
That probably
"Yeah."
tells a lot about your personality type.
Interesting. Yeah, of course, people always say like, "Oh, you'll be late to your own funeral." And it's one of those things that like when my funeral happens, I want it to be late. I want it to be true to fashion. I want it to start behind. I'm getting better at notifying ahead of time versus waiting until the time. So I think I let you know 10 minutes before our time that I was running behind. So I'm trying to be better about those things and really just be on time more. So it's now more rare that I'm behind and it's like perpetually 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes behind
I
everything.
mean, that's who you are. I mentioned in the book, like it's good to have our anchor, right? So that way we don't lose sight of who we are. Not to say you're always going to be late, but just that relative relationship to time is always going to be there, and you don't want to really change that because you don't want to change yourself, right? But knowing who you are, or knowing that, helps us go like, okay, now that I know this who I am, and this might be some of my flaws, or these are some of my flaws that I have based on my personality, I can work on them a little bit and kind of adjust.
Yeah, for sure. Just because I don't want to disrespect other people's time. And that's the part that,
Yeah.
like, yes, this is kind of how I operate, and they shouldn't have to wait on me. And so I am trying to kind of set start times that are about 20 minutes earlier than they really will start. But then I become aware of the fact that that I created that system and that it
Mhm.
like I really so then I tell myself that I do have that gap. And then of course we're right back where we started trying a new and different strategy.
You're like, I got this 10-minute cushion because I always have it that way. So you have to just extend it 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and then it's going to become like an hour. You're like, okay, yeah, I
Exactly.
got an hour cushion.
Exactly. Yeah. So tell me, so you did the education program company. You really wanted to make sure that it tailored to each of these kids in their own specific way. And then how did that evolve over time?
It's like something as simple as I would tell my teachers, like, you might have a student, I'm going to be using like not weird animal names, but my personality types are all using animal archetypes. So if I say like, oh,
Yeah.
a beaver, that's the reason why. And I would
Right.
tell my teachers, like, if you have a shark student, let's say, sharks are very straightforward. They're very blunt. They don't really care about school that much because school, they think books are kind of like useless because they tend to learn by practical reasons, but they also like to take risks. And I think most teachers fall into a specific category that values safety and security. So, which makes sense, right? You're especially elementary school teachers. You're like creating this classroom environment. Everything is kind of like same in terms of like October, you're gonna get Halloween, November, you're gonna get Thanksgiving, and all the decorations. Um,
Yep.
what's the first thing you learn? What's your name, or what's the process of putting your name down? What are the rules of the classroom? Anyway, so that's what most elementary school teachers are. So the natural
Okay.
instinct they'll tell a student who's taking a lot of risks is they'll tell them to be careful. And I always would tell my teachers, like, that's the worst thing you can tell certain personality types because their confidence comes from their ability to take risks. And if you tell them to be careful, you're telling them that the risks that they're taking are wrong. And if you tell a kid that like at 6, 7, or 8, then they might not ever develop those strengths that are going to come in handy when they grow older and maybe become a firefighter or become, I don't know, a Wall Street stockbroker or a businessman or like something where, taking risks is vital. And so I always tell my teachers, tell them to concentrate or tell them to focus instead of telling them to be careful. And just that change of wording really empowers the student versus telling them there's something wrong with them.
Yeah, I love that. I have pivoted into, and I'm curious what you think about it. I have pivoted into telling my kids to pay attention or be mindful. Like, hey,
Hmm.
be mindful, be aware when they're like that's two boys, they're just feral. So it's I'm more so wanting to make sure that they're safe without kind of giving that carefulness that I worry will become anxiousness. And I have
Yeah.
seen that some of those studies where they show a kid just kind of going for it and trying like a leap over something, and then once they're told, "Hey, just make sure you don't fall," they then start questioning themselves and then overthink it and then might actually fall. So how do you what do you think about that approach? Because I was never around kids. I'm the youngest child. I was born to be a partner, not a parent, even though I am a parent. There's a lot of this that I'm not primed for. So how what kind of advice would you give, 1 for me with that, and 2 with parents in general in determining what their kids type is?
Well, first, I think those are really good instincts, right? Like, I think the instinct to even tell yourself, like, oh, I don't want to take away their power. If I don't want to make them anxious or questioning themselves. So I'm going to tell them, like, and being mindful is actually a great way to put it, right? Because that really is what you're telling them. When we say be careful, concentrate, focus, it really means like it's okay to juggle chainsaws. But when you're doing it, make sure that you're looking at the chainsaw, you're looking at your hands, and you're putting one next, in combination with the other, right? And
Yeah.
I think is really great. I would recommend for parents, you start reading